Hello, welcome to another edition of Lore Maker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you're unfamiliar with this segment, this is basically we take some time with a member of the lore team to dig into some of the systems that you see on the star map, and ultimately we'll be able to play and visit and inhabit in the Star Citizen universe. And so we'll just get started. So today, we are actually going to start with kind of a smaller system, but sort of a personal favorite of mine, because Will took Elysium, which I love the Tavaran, and so I'm a little upset about that. Anyway, so we're actually going to do the Farron system. Now, if you remember some of the, if you are subscribers, you saw a Jump Point Galactic Guide that sort of highlighted Farron's system, gave you a bit of an idea. So we'll go into this sort of overall sense of the system, sort of the planets themselves, and a little bit into the sort of the backstory and kind of what's fun about them. But they're kind of a sneaky one, because I really like them just because visually feels like it's a very rich world. But okay, so let's jump right in. So this is not Farron's system that we're looking at now. This is a planet called Earth, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point and talk about. I don't know what happens there off the top of my head. So we'll go Farron's system. And bookmark. So, Farron's system, actually, you know what? Actually, before we dive in, let's actually go a little bit more macro. So we're going to zoom out here. So you can see it's sort of proximity to Sol system here. So Earth there, Farron here. Let's turn on jumps. So you can see it's very close. So it's, Croshaw, which famously was the first system that Nick Croshaw discovered, which led to this idea that, oh wow, we don't need to, physically burn our way towards these other star systems. We actually have these tunnels that we can use to get there, which completely, obviously, revolutionized kind of thinking as far as astro travel. So. Basically, the idea was once that happened, and people started to realize that this happened once, so it's a good possibility that it could happen again. It sort of created this new culture of nav jumpers, explorers, and sort of inflamed this sort of notion of like we need to kind of start re-examining our galaxy and with this new understanding and see what we can find out. So in the year 2460, basically, Farron's system was discovered coming out of Croshaw, right there. And so the funny thing about the way it was discovered by a guy named Pally Lamette, who was part of a Sol Astro Exploration Society. And it was sort of if you think of those sort of classic, if you read League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Alan Quatermain, explorer type things, these sort of gentlemen that would, go out and be exploring the galaxy and stuff like that. That was sort of the impetus, the idea behind them. So he was in charge, he was captain of a ship who was out looking for potentially new jump points. And so they were sort of at the end of their tether, they were about to run out of supplies and stuff like that. And basically one of his crew named Darcy Farron ended up discovering that there was a weird anomaly with their gas. Basically, like their fuel was not adding up, and through exploration, they ended up discovering that it was basically kind of getting drained. And so they started scanning, and they ended up discovering that it was actually a jump point that was sort of causing this sort of weird fuel anomaly. And that's what ended up leading to the discovery of Farron's system. And so, as sort of compensation, which for discovering this, he decided to name the system after Darcy. So, and then of course, being part of the Sol Astro Exploration Society, it was all for the benefit of humanity's advancement and stuff like that. So they donated the system basically to at the time it was the UNE, United Nations of Earth, and for basically expansion into. So Farron's system was then born. So one of the things we always sort of discover when we kind of work this stuff out is when a system is discovered, basically there's a period where the reigning government, which in this case would be the UNE, would sort of analyze and assess the system. And so they would take time before kind of opening up to the public, where they would look at the planets and they would kind of do a sort of surveying gig to see what the system held. Was there, I mean, potentially any dangers, all that type of stuff. And once things started to get a little crazier, as they do in the next few hundred years, once this sort of rapid age of expansion starts, they started to slip a little bit on that kind of stuff. But so when they got into Farron, they basically looked around and started scanning it, and they basically discovered that it was 4 planets. And we zoom right in here to the star, which is very big and bright. It is, I'm sure as all of you can see, it is a F-type main sequence dwarf star. So basically you have Farron 1, as you can see right here, is very, very small. Although it doesn't like to say that, but it's technically it's a mesoplanet, and basically it was sort of uninteresting. A lot of these planets just turned out to be sort of like meh. We can take it or leave it. They couldn't terraform it, so it was sort of but it was very, very close to the star, which is sort of the one unique, as you can see here, aspect to it. So you have the next in line, you have Farron 2, which is a terrestrial coreless planet. So there's no atmosphere on the planet, and soil samples basically determined that there was no real minerals there to harvest. Few minerals there were there, they ended up kind of cleaning out rather quickly. The big thing with Farron and sort of the immediate association with it when sort of approaching the system and breaking it down was sort of thinking of a once thriving, popular, very rich, resource-heavy system that suffered a complete and total economic collapse. So it died, but it's still trudging on type thing was sort of the idea. So we have basically Farron 3, which is somewhere on here, ISEA. So ISEA was basically heavy resources, tons of stuff to mine. So mining became immediately like the number one thing to do there. And so as such, basically they were able to extract a lot of minerals, and make a lot of money. And so a lot of money, like industry moved in there, started building up the city, the main city, or sort of the landing zone that we're sort of thinking now is called Tram, was sort of this massive industrial mega city, effectively. And it was like that for a very, very, very long time. Basically, Tram and Farron fueled the economy of the UNE. And so when they were first looking at the planet, they realized that there were so many resources there that they had to be smart about how they divided it up. They couldn't just do a land rush because it would just get too crazy. And so the idea was that basically they were trying to mediate basically the land rights and the mining rights and stuff like that for the planet. And it was so messed up, and they kind of screwed the pooch so badly on it that the government ended up, because at the time, bear in mind that this was still the United Nations of Earth, so Earth was very much the center point of the universe and the expansion. So, Croshaw system didn't necessarily have much representation. They were represented by nations, of Earth type thing. So, what ended up happening was once this system basically came to be, and they were trying to break apart this planet to assign mining rights, it got so screwed up that some people actually claimed that, or believed that, it's what triggered the transition into the United Planets of Earth, which became the sort of planet is sort of the early foundation framework for what would ultimately become the UEE. So planets would gain equal representation along with Earth and stuff like that. And so, so it basically, on one hand, ended up pushing humanity forward in a way that they probably didn't necessarily anticipate. So basically just think massive development, massive mining operations, tons of money. Gold rush type, that type of tone to it. So just a lot of money in there and presumably probably a lot of crime moved in along with it, because that kind of tends to go hand in hand. But it was on a fast track. So it basically got it was one of the big boys, if you will, of the UPE, because it was such a massive economic force within the planets. And I mean, this went on for centuries, literally. And so basically, even through most of the Messer era, once they rose to power, it was still, they probably gained kind of a reputation that they were untouchable because they came from such a position of power and resource that they were almost untouchable. But these being kind of fanatical family of despots, they will find a way. But they didn't manage to last until the last Messer, Messer 11, who was Linton Messer, if I remember correctly, who basically falsely accused the system of housing dissidents and tried to put them on lockdown. It was obviously very untrue because he was kind of a lunatic, but scared enough people that thought that the hammer of the Messers was coming down, that they ended up, some of the wealthier citizens and people just started fleeing the system because they just didn't want to be a part of whatever kind of bad stuff was about to go down there. And there was a whole thing, if you've read the story about the 78th Squadron, got orders to kill civilians and they refused, and it was this sort of big to-do. And then luckily, the Messers were overthrown the next year, so, yay. So the system managed to kind of limp on, but the sort of mortal strike had already kind of happened, and it was starting to falter. And then it wasn't until the sort of mid-29th century where they started, sort of the unthinkable was happening, where they were running out of stuff to mine. There was only so much that they could do. Basically, the system started to dry up. Whatever money that was still there was starting to realize that they were taking losses by trying to, strangle whatever minimal resources from the ground that they could. And so companies started leaving, and then basically they had nothing lined up, that could offer the type of income, basically, or export that their mining stuff had. And so the system basically just sort of completely collapsed and fell on itself. So, which leads to the thing I love about it. Tram as a city, you sort of imagine these sort of massive. I was thinking of like, early 1900s, like Chicago, Detroit, like these sort of massive just buildings and just beautiful structures of industry and stuff like that are now just abandoned and falling apart and stuff like that. At the time, I was actually reading a really fun book. Well, not reading, but I had a fun book called Detroit Disassembled, which is an urban exploration photography book that's just these beautiful pictures of downtown Detroit and just sort of the state of sort of urban decay and stuff like that. And it's really beautiful. I mean, sad and beautiful, and but that was sort of the thing that whenever I think of Tram is what I kind of think of, these sort of like huge, beautiful buildings that just sort of represented at one point sort of the pinnacle of human industry and commerce and stuff like that are now just these sort of shadows of what they used to be and stuff like that, and this sort of the people that are still there and stuff. So it's one of those places that, if I'm ever trying to work out a character and I kind of want them to give them an inherent edge, to me, Tram is always the first place I think of like, oh, they should come from Tram because they've clearly had a really hard upbringing. And also, actually, if you look at the Gent Gallen, I believe in the news updates, who had been caught trying to, as a spy in Xi'an territory, he was from Tram. So that's sort of kind of that sort of background. Okay, so that's a very long description of Asura. And then way out there, we have Farron 4, which is a gas giant. And it's a gas giant. You can't live there. Presumably you have fuel that you can grab from it, but yeah, it's pretty much just a gas giant. It just kind of hangs out. That's what they do. So yeah, that's basically Farron in a nutshell. I'd like to thank all of our subscribers who kick in extra money every month to support content like my rambling about decrepit cities. And yeah, we will see you next time on Lore Maker's Guide to the Galaxy.